Eastern Front, Soviet Union. December 1941. The moment Dmitry Volkov heard the German tanks, he knew his son would never come home. The rumble started low, like distant thunder trapped beneath the frozen earth. But Dmitry recognized it immediately. Not thunder, not artillery, but the mechanical heartbeat of Panzer IIIs rolling across the snow-covered fields toward their position. He stood in the doorway of what remained of the tractor repair depot, his oil-stained hands gripping a wrench so tightly his knuckles had turned white beneath the grime and cold. Behind him, the depot was a cathedral of broken machinery. Skeletal frames of tractors stood like iron ribs against the dim light filtering through shell holes in the corrugated roof. The smell was overwhelming. Diesel fuel mixing with the acrid bite of cordite that hung in the air from yesterday's bombardment. And underneath it all, the sweet, sick odor of death that no amount of snow could mask. "Dmitry Sergeyevich," a voice called from the darkness of the workshop. "They're coming. We need to leave, now." The voice belonged to Alexei Kuskov, 23 years old, too young to have the haunted eyes of a man who'd already buried his entire family under the rubble of Minsk. He emerged from behind a dismantled V2 diesel engine, his face smudged with grease, his breath forming small clouds in the freezing air. The temperature had dropped to -20 degrees Celsius, cold enough that the moisture in your nose froze with each breath, cold enough that exposed skin would blacken with frostbite in minutes. Dmitry didn't move. He was 52, old enough to remember the revolution, old enough to have built this very depot with his own hands in 1928, when Stalin's collectivization had transformed the Russian countryside. Old enough to know that running meant nothing when the Germans had already taken everything. "My boy is out there," Dmitry said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mikhail is with the 32nd Tank Brigade. They said they'd hold the line at Tula." Alexei's expression softened with the particular kind of grief that had become common currency in the Soviet Union that winter. They both knew what "holding the line" meant. The Wehrmacht had swept through the western territories like a scythe through wheat. Operation Barbarossa had shattered the illusion of Soviet invincibility in a matter of weeks. 3 million German soldiers had poured across the border in June. And now, 6 months later, they stood at the gates of Moscow itself. "Then we honor him by surviving," Alexei said, moving closer. "We honor all of them." The rumble grew louder. Through the broken windows, they could see the tree line approximately 800 meters away beginning to shudder. Snow cascaded from pine branches as the earth itself seemed to vibrate. Then they appeared. The first Panzer III, its turret rotating slowly like the head of some prehistoric predator, followed by another and another. 5 tanks in total, painted in winter camouflage, their tracks churning through the snow with methodical, terrifying efficiency. Dmitry's mind raced through the mathematics of survival. The depot sat on the eastern edge of the village of Volokolamsk, 60 kilometers northwest of Moscow. The village itself was already gone, burned to foundations by retreating Soviet forces following Stalin's scorched earth policy. Better to deny the Germans shelter than to let them rest comfortably in Russian homes. The civilian population had been evacuated weeks ago, though evacuated was a generous term for the chaotic exodus of frozen refugees stumbling eastward with whatever possessions they could carry. "Look at that," Alexei whispered, pointing. Between the advancing German tanks and the depot, half buried in snow, sat the carcass of a Soviet T-34 tank. It had been abandoned 3 days earlier when its crew had fled after the transmission failed. The T-34 was a masterpiece of Soviet engineering. Sloped armor that could deflect German shells, a powerful 76mm gun, and the same V2 diesel engine that Dmitry had spent his entire adult life maintaining in tractors. It was the best tank in the world, superior to anything the Germans had. But superiority meant nothing when your tank wouldn't move. Dmitry stared at the disabled T-34, then turned to look at the workshop behind him. Scattered across the floor were parts from dozens of tractors, engines, transmissions, drive shafts, gears. This depot had once serviced every collective farm within 50 kilometers. He knew every bolt, every gasket, every millimeter of these machines. An impossible idea began to form in his mind. "Alexei," he said slowly, "that tractor engine we pulled from the STZ-3 yesterday, the big one. Is it still functional?" Alexei frowned, confused. Yes, but… And the transmission assembly from the Komunar harvester? It's in pieces, but we could… Alexei's eyes widened as understanding dawned. No, Dmitri Sergeyevich, no, that's insane. Is it? Dmitri turned to face the younger man fully. His face was weathered like old leather, carved with lines that told stories of hard winters and harder choices. But his eyes burned with something that had been absent for weeks: purpose. The Germans will be here in 10 minutes. We can run, hide in the forest like rabbits, and freeze to death by morning, or we can do something that matters. The Panzer IIIs had closed half the distance now, 400 meters. They moved with the confidence of conquerors, knowing that this sector had been abandoned by organized Soviet resistance. Behind the tanks, Dmitri could see infantry, maybe 20 soldiers in their gray winter uniforms, rifles slung casually across their backs. They weren't expecting a fight. They were just mopping up. Alexei looked from Dmitri to the disabled T-34 to the pile of tractor parts, his mind clearly racing through the impossibility of what the old mechanic was suggesting. Even if we could somehow get that tank moving again, we're 2 mechanics, not tank crew. We don't know how to fire the gun, operate the… My son is a tanker, Dmitri interrupted. Before he left, he told me everything. Made me promise I'd understand what he did, why it mattered. I know how to fire the gun. I know how to work the radio, and you… He pointed at Alexei. You're the best mechanic I've ever seen. If anyone can make this work, it's us. The younger man's face cycled through disbelief, fear, and something else. Something that looked almost like hunger. How long had it been since either of them had felt anything other than helplessness? How long since they'd been able to fight back? How long would we have? Alexei asked, and Dmitri knew he'd won. 300 meters, Dmitri calculated, watching the German advance. At their current speed, maybe 7 minutes before they're on top of us. That's not enough time to… Then we'd better move fast. What followed was a symphony of controlled chaos that would have made any formally trained engineer weep. Dmitri and Alexei burst into motion with the synchronized precision of men who'd worked together for years. They grabbed a cable winch from the wall and sprinted toward the disabled T-34, their boots crunching through the knee-deep snow. The cold bit at their exposed faces like thousands of tiny knives. The T-34's hatch was frozen shut. Dmitri attacked it with a crowbar while Alexei secured the winch cable to the depot's main support beam. The metal screamed in protest as the hatch finally gave way, and Dmitri hauled himself up and dropped into the tank's interior. Inside, it was like entering a metal tomb. The crew had left in a hurry. There were still personal effects scattered around the cramped space. A photograph of a woman and child tucked into the gunner's station. A half-eaten piece of black bread frozen solid. The air smelled of machine oil and unwashed bodies. Dmitri didn't have time for sentiment. He wedged himself into the driver's position and examined the failed transmission. As he suspected, it was a catastrophic gear failure, the kind that would normally require a full factory replacement. But normal had died somewhere back in June. "Alexei!" he shouted up through the hatch. "I need the STZ tractor engine, the Komunar transmission gears, the drive shaft from the DT-54, and every welding tool we have. Move." 200 meters. The Panzers had slowed slightly, their commanders probably surveying the depot to determine if it was worth investigating or should just be shelled from a distance. Eastern Front, Soviet Union, December 1941. Time remaining: 7 minutes. Alexei Kuskov had never believed in God, but as he dragged the STZ-3 tractor engine across the snow-covered ground toward the disabled T-34, he found himself praying to every deity he'd ever heard of. The engine weighed nearly 300 kilograms, and even with the improvised sled he'd constructed from scrap metal, every meter felt like a kilometer. His lungs burned with each breath of frozen air. Sweat poured down his face despite the -20-degree temperature, freezing instantly in his beard and eyebrows. Behind him, the workshop was already being ransacked. He'd thrown tools, parts, welding equipment into a canvas tarp, and was dragging everything like some demented Santa Claus delivering death instead of toys. 175 meters, Dmitri's voice shouted from inside the T-34's hull. The old mechanic had positioned himself where he could see through the driver's vision slit, tracking the German advance with the cold precision of a man who had already accepted his death and was now working on borrowed time. The lead Panzer III had stopped. Through the swirling snow, Alexei could see its commander standing in the open turret hatch, binoculars raised, scanning the depot. The German officer was maybe 40 years old, wearing the distinctive black uniform of the Panzerwaffe, with an iron cross visible even at this distance. He was examining the abandoned T-34 with the kind of professional interest one predator shows another. Alexei reached the tank and began hauling equipment up onto the hull. "Dmitry Sergeyevich, they've stopped. The commander is looking right at us." "Then we'd better give him something to think about," came the reply from inside the steel beast. "Get down here. We're running out of time." Alexei dropped through the hatch and into the T-34's interior. The cramped space was designed for a crew of 4, commander, gunner, loader, and driver. Now it held 2 mechanics and enough spare parts to stock a small workshop. The dim light from the open hatch revealed Dmitry on his back beneath the transmission housing, his hands already black with grease and blood from where he'd torn open his knuckles on frozen metal. "What do you need?" Alexei asked, wedging himself into the narrow space beside the older man. "Everything," Dmitry grunted. "The main gear assembly is completely stripped. The driveshaft has a fracture that goes halfway through. The clutch plates are welded together from heat stress. And we have..." He glanced at his watch, a battered Pobeda that had somehow survived everything the war had thrown at him. 6 minutes to fix it all. It was impossible. Both men knew it. The kind of repairs they were contemplating would take a trained team of factory technicians 2 days minimum, with proper tools and a heated workspace. They had neither. What they had was rage, desperation, and the accumulated knowledge of decades spent coaxing life from machinery that everyone else had written off as dead. "The STZ engine," Dmitry commanded. "Strip the main drive gear. We'll adapt it to fit the T-34's housing. The tolerances are completely different. I know. We'll make it fit." Alexei grabbed a wrench and went to work. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, years of muscle memory taking over where conscious thought would have been too slow. The STZ-3 was a tractor designed for pulling plows through the stubborn Russian earth, overbuilt to withstand abuse that would destroy lesser machines. Its gears were crude compared to the precision-engineered components of a military tank. But crude had one advantage. It could be modified with the tools at hand. Outside, engines revved. The panzers were moving again. 150 meters, Dmitry called out. "They're spreading out. Combat formation." Alexei's hands didn't stop moving, but his mind raced through the tactical implications. Combat formation meant the Germans were treating the depot as a potential threat. Good. It meant they'd approach cautiously. Bad. It meant they were preparing to destroy anything that moved. "Got it," he said, yanking the drive gear free from the tractor engine. The component was massive, 30 centimeters across and weighing at least 20 kilos. He handed it down to Dmitry, who immediately began the impossible task of fitting it into the T-34's transmission housing. The sound of metal grinding against metal filled the tank's interior, a shriek that set Alexei's teeth on edge. Dmitry was using brute force and a sledgehammer to reshape the gear's mounting points, pounding away with controlled fury. Sparks flew in the darkness, briefly illuminating the old mechanic's face. Set in absolute concentration, he looked like some ancient blacksmith forging a weapon for a doomed king. "It's not seating properly," Dmitry hissed. "Hand me the cutting torch." "We don't have time to..." "Now!" Alexei grabbed the acetylene torch and ignited it. The blue-white flame cast dancing shadows as Dmitry applied heat to the transmission housing, expanding the metal just enough to force the oversized gear into place. The smell of burning oil mixed with hot metal filled the cramped space. Both men were coughing, eyes watering, but neither stopped. 125 meters, Dmitry reported, not looking up from his work. "The lead tank is traversing its turret. I think they've spotted us moving inside." Alexei felt his heart hammering against his ribs. They were committed now. Even if they wanted to run, there wasn't time to extract themselves from inside the T-34 before the Germans arrived. They would finish this repair, or they would die trying. There was no third option. "Drive shaft," Dmitri ordered. "We need to bridge the gap between the engine and the transmission." This was where things got truly desperate. The T-34's original drive shaft was cracked, but Alexei had brought 3 different shafts from various farm equipment, each the wrong size and length. He laid them out on the hull floor and began measuring with nothing more than a piece of wire and his practiced eye. The DT-54 shaft, cut to 1 meter 20 centimeters, welded to the Kommunar coupling. It might work. Might? Dmitri looked up, his face streaked with grease and sweat. Will. Alexei corrected himself. It will work. He grabbed a hacksaw and began cutting through solid steel. His arms screamed in protest, muscles burning from exertion and cold and the unnatural stress position required to work in the tank's confined space. The saw's teeth bit into the metal with agonizing slowness. Each stroke took an eternity. Each second felt like the Germans were getting closer, closer, closer. 100 meters, Dmitri said quietly. They've stopped again. I can see infantry dismounting. Alexei didn't respond. He couldn't. All his concentration was focused on the saw, on keeping the cut straight and true. A jagged edge would mean the shaft wouldn't seat properly, wouldn't transfer power, would fail at the worst possible moment. His hands were shaking, from cold, from fear, from exhaustion, but he forced them steady through sheer will. The shaft came free. He immediately positioned it and fired up the welding torch. The electric arc lit up the tank's interior like lightning, casting harsh shadows that made Dmitri look like a ghost. Alexei worked with frantic precision, laying down bead after bead of weld, fusing the mismatched components into a single functioning unit. 75 meters, Dmitri reported. They're forming a skirmish line. 20 infantry, 5 tanks. Standard clearing procedure. The weld cooled. Alexei tested it with a hammer. Solid. Not pretty, not regulation, but solid. He and Dmitri worked together now, their movements synchronized like dancers who'd practiced the same routine 1,000 times. Bolt the drive shaft, connect the coupling, align the transmission, tighten the mounting bolts. Dmitri's watch showed 3 minutes had passed since they'd started. 4 minutes remaining. But, remaining until what, was a question neither man wanted to answer. Fuel pump, Dmitri said. Check the fuel pump. Alexei scrambled to the engine compartment at the tank's rear. The V2 diesel engine sat cold and dark, its 12 cylinders silent. He checked the fuel lines, frozen. Of course they were frozen. He grabbed a candle from his pocket, a habit from working in unheated workshops, and began playing the flame along the fuel lines, melting the ice blockages. 50 meters, Dmitri called out. His voice had changed, become flatter, more controlled. Combat voice. The voice of a man preparing for violence. The first fuel line cleared with a gurgling sound as diesel began flowing again. Then the second. Third. Alexei worked faster, singing the flames too close, scorching paint, not caring. All that mattered was getting fuel to the engine. Eastern Front, Soviet Union. December 1941. Time remaining. 2 minutes. The moment Dmitri Volkov's hand touched the starter button, he thought of his son. Mikhail would have been proud of this insanity. The boy had always loved the impossible. As a child, he'd tried to teach their old farm dog to climb trees, had attempted to build a flying machine from barrel hoops and bedsheets, had insisted that one day he'd drive a tank that could defeat any German panzer ever made. Now here was his father, 52 years old with arthritic knees and failing eyesight, about to test whether a T-34 powered by tractor parts could actually move, let alone fight. 30 meters, Dmitri whispered, more to himself than to Alexei. Through the driver's vision slit, he could see individual German soldiers now, their faces pink with cold, breath steaming in the frigid air, rifles held with casual confidence of men who'd conquered half of Europe. The lead tank commander was still standing in his turret, one hand raised, directing his infantry forward in textbook clearing formation. Alexei had wedged himself into the gunner's position, though neither of them had any illusions about their ability to actually hit anything with the 76mm main gun. The T-34's optics were designed for trained tank crews, not mechanics who'd spent their lives fixing farm equipment. But the gun was loaded. The previous crew had abandoned the tank with a round already chambered, and that meant they had at least one shot before they became target practice. "Everything's connected," Alexei said, his voice tight with tension. "Fuel is flowing. Drivetrain is as aligned as we could manage in 4 minutes. The transmission—" He paused. "God only knows if it'll hold." "Then we'd better find out," Dmitri replied. He positioned his feet on the clutch and brake pedals, his right hand on the gear shift, his left hovering over the starter. The controls felt familiar and alien at once, the same principles as the tractors he'd operated for decades, but scaled up to 40 tons of armored steel designed to kill and survive killing. 20 meters, he breathed. "They're close enough to throw grenades now." He could hear German voices outside, sharp, efficient commands in a language he didn't speak but understood perfectly. The universal language of soldiers preparing to assault a position. Safeties clicking off. Grenades being readied. The metallic slide of machine gun bolts being pulled back. Dmitri pressed the starter button. Nothing happened. He pressed again, holding it down. Still, nothing. No grinding of starter motor, no cough of cylinders trying to catch, just dead silence from the massive V2 diesel engine. "Fuel pump," Alexei hissed. "I know," Dmitri cut him off. He released the starter and fumbled in the darkness for the manual fuel primer pump. His fingers, numb from cold and slick with oil, couldn't find purchase on the small handle. He could feel panic rising in his chest like ice water, threatening to freeze his lungs, his thoughts, his nerve. Outside, a German voice shouted, "Halt!" Someone had seen movement inside the tank. Dmitri's fingers closed around the primer pump handle. He began working it frantically, forcing fuel through the system with desperate speed. 1 pump, 2, 3, 4. Each stroke felt like it took an hour. Each second felt like the last second of his life. "Granite!" The German word for grenade cut through the winter air. Dmitri slammed his hand down on the starter button. The V2 diesel engine coughed once, a wet, rattling sound, like a dying old man trying to clear his throat. Then it coughed again, louder. Then it caught. The roar that filled the T-34's interior was unlike anything Dmitri had ever heard. Not the smooth, refined purr of a properly tuned engine, but a violent, angry bellow. The sound of tractor parts and tank components forced into unnatural marriage, screaming in protest at every revolution. The entire hull vibrated with mechanical fury. Loose tools bounced and clattered. The welded drive shaft howled like a tortured animal. But it ran. The grenade detonated against the T-34's rear armor with a sharp bang that rang through the hull like a hammer strike on a bell. Dmitri's ears rang, but the armor held. The Germans outside were shouting now, surprised voices mixing with commands to fall back, to take cover, to prepare anti-tank weapons. "They thought we were dead," Alexei laughed, a slightly hysterical sound. "They thought this was just a wreck." Dmitri didn't laugh. His hands moved with mechanical precision honed by decades of driving tractors through mud, snow, and ice. Clutch in. First gear engaged. The transmission ground and shrieked, metal on metal, the tractor gears trying to mesh with tank components they were never designed to touch. For one horrible moment, Dmitri thought the entire assembly would tear itself apart. Then the gears caught. The T-34 lurched forward like a drunk stumbling from a bar fight. The motion was rough, violent, accompanied by sounds no tank should ever make. But it moved. 40 tons of Soviet armor, resurrected from death by 2 mechanics and spare parts, began rolling across the frozen ground. Through his vision slit, Dmitri saw the German infantry scattering. They'd been walking casually toward what they thought was an abandoned hulk, and suddenly that hulk had roared to life and was grinding toward them at increasing speed. He saw their faces, shock, confusion, fear, as they threw themselves into the snow, desperately seeking cover. "The lead Panzer!" Alexei shouted. "It's traversing!" Dmitri saw it too. The Panzer III commander had reacted with impressive speed, dropping into his turret and ordering his gunner to engage. The German tank's 50mm gun was already rotating toward them, the barrel tracking with smooth hydraulic precision. They had seconds. "Can you fire?" Dmitri yelled over the engine's roar. "I don't know!" Alexei had his eye pressed to the gunner's sight, his hand on the elevation wheel, trying to remember everything Dmitri had told him about tank gunnery based on third-hand information from Mikhail. "The sight picture is all wrong, I can't tell if— Just fire!" Alexei pulled the trigger. The 76mm gun spoke with a voice like God's own thunder. The recoil rocked the entire tank backward, nearly stalling the improvised engine. Spent shell casing ejected with a metallic clang, tumbling through the cramped interior and landing on Dmitri's leg, hot enough to burn even through his thick winter clothes. Through the acrid smoke that filled the vision slit, Dmitri saw their shot had missed. The round sailing high and to the left, detonating harmlessly in the snow 50 meters beyond the German tank. But it had achieved something more important than a hit. It had announced that this was not a derelict. This was a fighting vehicle with ammunition and crew willing to use it. The Panzer III commander apparently reached the same conclusion. Instead of pressing the attack, the German tanks stopped and began backing up, turrets still trained on the T-34 but creating distance. Smart tactical thinking. Put space between himself and an unknown threat. Bring supporting units into position, then destroy the enemy with coordinated fire. Dmitri wasn't about to let that happen. He shifted into second gear, the transmission howling in protest, and pushed the throttle forward. The T-34 surged ahead with all the grace of a wounded bear, engine bellowing, tracks churning through snow and frozen earth. The speedometer needle climbed, 10 kilometers per hour, 15, 20. Each gear change felt like it might be the one that finally stripped the tractor components to scrap metal, but somehow the impossible amalgamation held together. "They're falling back," Alexei reported. "All 5 tanks backing toward the tree line." "Reload!" Dmitri commanded. He had no idea what he was doing, no training, no experience, just raw instinct and the memory of his son's stories about tank combat. Keep moving. Never be a stationary target. Press the attack before the enemy can coordinate. Make them react to you instead of executing their plan. Alexei wrestled with the 76mm shell, a massive cylinder of brass and high explosive that weighed 25 pounds. The loader's position had its own seat and specialized equipment, but Alexei was trying to do the job while jammed into the gunner's station. He grabbed the shell from the ready rack, struggled to line it up with the gun's breech, and finally managed to slam it home. The breech closed with a satisfying clunk. "Loaded!" he gasped, already exhausted from the physical effort. The German infantry had recovered from their initial shock and were now setting up firing positions. Dmitri saw muzzle flashes as they opened fire with rifles and machine guns. Bullets pinged off the T-34's armor like hail on a tin roof, dangerous to anyone outside, but merely annoying to the men inside 40 millimeters of sloped steel plate. But the Panzers were a different story. Eastern Front, Soviet Union. December 1941. The last stand. The first German shell hit the ground 3 meters to the left of the T-34, erupting in a geyser of frozen earth and snow that slammed against the hull like a physical blow. Dmitri felt the tank shudder, felt the steering fight against his hands as debris peppered the left track. Through the vision slit, everything had become a chaos of white smoke, flying dirt, and the muzzle flashes of German guns. "Hard right!" Alexei screamed, though Dmitri was already turning, wrenching the steering levers with every ounce of strength in his aging arms. The T-34 lurched sideways, the improvised transmission grinding and shrieking in protest. The sound was apocalyptic, like feeding sheet metal through a wood chipper while someone beat on it with sledgehammers. But the tank turned, presenting its heavily sloped frontal armor toward the enemy. Another shell screamed past, so close that Dmitri swore he could feel the heat of its passage through the steel walls. This one came from a different angle. The Germans had spread out, creating a crossfire that would bracket them from multiple directions. Standard tank killing tactics. Textbook Wehrmacht efficiency. They had maybe 30 seconds before the Panzers found their range and turned the T-34 into a coffin. "I need a target!" Alexei shouted. His face was pressed against the gunner's sight, eye watering from the strain, hands white-knuckled on the traverse wheel. "I can't see anything through all this smoke!" Dmitri's mind raced through the geometry of the battlefield. 5 German tanks, spread in a rough semicircle approximately 200 meters away. The lead Panzer III, the one whose commander had been standing in the turret, was slightly forward of the others, its turret still tracking the T-34's erratic movements. That commander had made a mistake. pushed too far ahead of his supporting units in his eagerness to finish off what should have been easy prey. Mistakes could be exploited. "The lead tank," Dmitri called out. 11 o'clock, 200 meters. It's separated from the others. "I can't. The sight is off. I'm not a gunner. I don't know how to—" "You're a mechanic," Dmitri interrupted, his voice cutting through the chaos with sudden clarity. "So stop trying to be a soldier and be what you are. Forget the sight. Use your eyes. You've calculated angles and trajectories your entire life. Every time you lifted a load, positioned a crane, lined up a weld. This is just another machine, Alexei. Just another problem to solve." Something changed in the younger man's face. The panic didn't disappear, but it transformed, channeled into the same focused intensity he brought to impossible repair jobs. His hands steadied on the traverse wheel. He wasn't trying to be a tank gunner anymore. He was Alexei Kuskov, a mechanic who could eyeball measurements to within millimeters, who could judge distances and angles by instinct honed over years of precision work. 200 meters, he muttered to himself. 40-ton target, moving right to left, angular velocity. Carry the one. His hands moved smoothly now, traversing the turret, elevating the gun. Wind from the northeast, maybe 15 kilometers per hour. Call it negligible at this range. A third German shell hit the T-34's right side, glancing off the sloped armor with a sound like a church bell being struck by lightning. The ricochet probably saved their lives. A direct, square hit would have penetrated even the T-34's excellent armor. But the impact still threw both men against the hull walls. Dmitri tasted blood where he'd bitten his tongue. "Now, Alexei," he shouted. "Take the shot now." Alexei pulled the trigger. The 76mm gun roared. Through the vision slit, Dmitri saw the tracer arc across the snow-covered battlefield, a finger of fire pointing accusation at the lead Panzer III. For one eternal moment, time seemed to stop. The shell flew true, crossing the 200 meters in less than a second, and struck the German tank precisely where the turret met the hull, the weak point in the Panzer III's armor, the junction where steel plates came together at less than optimal angles. The penetration was catastrophic. The German tank didn't explode. That only happened in movies. Instead, it simply stopped moving, its engine dying with a shudder that Dmitri could see even from this distance. Smoke began pouring from the turret hatches. A moment later, the commander, the same officer who'd been surveying the battlefield with such confidence minutes before, erupted from the top hatch, his uniform on fire, screaming in agony. He tumbled off the tank into the snow, rolling frantically to extinguish the flames. Alexei stared at what he'd done, his face gone white as the snow outside. "I hit him," he whispered. "Mother of God, I actually hit him." "And we'll hit another one if they give us the chance," Dmitri said, already wrestling the T-34 into motion again. But he knew, they both knew, that the chance wouldn't come. They'd gotten lucky once, caught the Germans by surprise, exploited a momentary tactical error. The remaining 4 panzers were already adjusting, their commanders screaming orders, their gunners acquiring new firing solutions. The radio crackled to life. Dmitri had forgotten they even had one. A burst of German voices, sharp and angry, coordinating their response. They didn't need to understand the language to know what was being said. Concentrate fire, bracket the target, eliminate the threat. "We need to move," Dmitri said, shoving the transmission into what he hoped was third gear. The gears caught after an agonizing delay, grinding together with a sound that promised imminent catastrophic failure. But they caught, and the T-34 surged forward, picking up speed. 25 kilometers per hour, 30. The speedometer needle was vibrating so badly, Dmitri could barely read it. The whole tank was shaking like it was trying to tear itself apart. Every weld was stressed to the breaking point. Every bolt was loosening. Every jury-rigged component was screaming for mercy. "Where are we going?" Alexei demanded, grabbing onto anything solid as the tank bounced over rough terrain. "The village!" Dmitri pointed ahead, where the burned-out ruins of Volokholamsk offered the only cover within a kilometer. "If we can reach the buildings, break their line of sight, we might—" The 4th German shell ended the sentence for him. This time, the shooter had led his target properly, calculated the T-34's speed and trajectory. The 50mm armor-piercing round struck the left track assembly dead center, and the hardened steel penetrator did exactly what it was designed to do. The track exploded in a shower of metal links and torn rubber, wrapping around the drive wheel like a snake in its death throes. The T-34 slewed violently to the left. Dmitri fought the steering, but with one track destroyed, the tank was done maneuvering. They ground to a halt at an angle, the engine still roaring, the damaged track clattering uselessly against the hull. "Transmissions seized," Alexei reported, his voice tight with controlled panic. "The drive shaft. I can smell it burning. We're dead in the water." Dmitri didn't need the report. He could feel it through the steering levers, through the pedals, through every point of contact between his body and the dying machine. The miracle they'd cobbled together had lasted perhaps 5 minutes of combat. 5 minutes of impossible functionality bought with desperation and skill. 5 minutes that felt like it should have been enough but wasn't, would never be enough, could never be enough against the Wehrmacht's mechanized might. Outside, the German infantry was advancing again, more cautiously now, but advancing. The remaining 4 panzers were hull down behind snow berms, turrets trained, ready to turn the crippled T-34 into scrap metal at the first sign of resistance. "We should surrender," Alexei said quietly. He wasn't looking at Dmitri, just staring at his oil-stained hands as if seeing them for the first time. "We're mechanics, not soldiers. The Geneva Convention, they have to treat us as civilians, right? We were just defending ourselves, we didn't—" "Reload the gun," Dmitri interrupted. "What?" "Reload the gun." Dmitri's voice was calm, almost gentle. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small photograph, creased and worn from being carried close to his heart. It showed a young man in a tanker's uniform, smiling at the camera with the kind of confidence that only comes from being 20 years old and believing yourself immortal. Mikhail Volkov, son of Dmitri, gunner in the 32nd Tank Brigade. "My boy is dead," Dmitri said, studying the photograph. "I knew it the moment I heard those German tanks coming. You can't hold a line against the Wehrmacht with what we had. Can't hold it and live. So he's gone, and I'll never see him again. And there's nothing in this world that can change that." He carefully folded the photograph and tucked it back into his pocket, over his heart. "But I can make sure his death meant something," Dmitri continued. "We took out one of their tanks, one tank that won't be advancing on Moscow, one tank that won't be killing Soviet soldiers, one tank's worth of ammunition and fuel that the Germans have lost. And if we surrender, then that's all we accomplish. But if we keep fighting, even for just a few more minutes, maybe we pin down their infantry. Maybe we force them to waste shells on a target that's already dead. Maybe we buy enough time for one Soviet unit somewhere to retreat, regroup, survive." Alexei was silent for a long moment, his youthful face aged by exhaustion and fear, and the weight of impossible choices. Then he reached for another 76mm shell. "I had a sister," he said softly, wrestling the heavy projectile toward the breach. "Natalia. She was 14 when the Germans came to Minsk. He paused, swallowing hard. "They made examples of partisans' families. She wasn't a partisan. She was 14 years old and her only crime was being Russian." The shell slammed home. The breach closed. "So yes," Alexei finished, positioning himself behind the gunner's sight one last time. "Let's make it mean something." Dmitri pulled the starter on the engine. It caught. Miracle of miracles. Even seized and dying, the impossible hybrid of tractor and tank still had some fight left. He couldn't move the hull, but he could traverse the turret. Could give Alexei a shot at the German tanks that were even now maneuvering for the kill. Through the vision slit, Dmitri saw the German infantry had closed to within 50 meters. They were setting up a machine gun position, preparing to hose down the T-34's vision ports and hatches, suppressing any attempt by the crew to bail out. Standard procedure for dealing with a disabled enemy tank. Efficient, professional, the Wehrmacht way. Behind the infantry, one of the panzers was pushing forward, clearly intending to finish the job at point-blank range where there was no possibility of missing. "Target," Dmitri called out calmly. 12 o'clock, 100 meters and closing. The panzer with the white crosses on the turret. "I see him," Alexei replied. His voice had gone flat, emotionless. the voice of a man who'd made peace with his death and was now just focused on taking someone with him. Range decreasing, 90 meters, 80. The German machine gun opened fire, bullets hammering against the T-34's hull in a continuous stream. The sound inside was deafening, like being trapped inside a bell while someone beat it with hammers. Dmitri felt something warm running down his face and realized a bullet had found a small gap in the vision slit's armor, sending a spray of spalled metal across his forehead. He wiped the blood away and kept his eyes on the enemy. 60 meters, Alexei said. 50. The approaching Panzer's gun was aimed directly at them now. At this range, the German gunner couldn't possibly miss. One shot would penetrate the T-34's frontal armor and turn the interior into a blast furnace. Both men knew it. Neither man flinched. 40 meters, Alexei breathed. 30. Now, Dmitri said. Alexei fired. At 30 meters, even a poor shot is difficult to miss. The 76mm shell crossed the distance in a fraction of a heartbeat and struck the advancing Panzer III in the center mass of its frontal armor. The German tank's armor was thinner than the T-34's, less sloped, designed to fight at longer ranges where its superior optics and training would give it the advantage. At 30 meters, those advantages meant nothing. The penetration was total. The shell punched through the armor plate, detonated inside the crew compartment, and turned the Panzer into a steel coffin for the 5 men inside. The tank rolled forward another 3 meters on momentum alone, then stopped, smoke pouring from every opening. 2, Alexei said softly. We got 2 of them. Not bad, Dmitri agreed. He could feel the T-34's engine dying now, the improvised components finally giving up after being pushed far beyond any reasonable limit. The temperature gauge had been pegged in the red for the last 2 minutes. He could smell burning oil, melting solder, metal stressed past its melting point. Not bad for 2 mechanics who were supposed to run away. The German infantry was pulling back, clearly unwilling to charge a tank that had just demonstrated it still had a functioning main gun. The remaining 3 panzers were repositioning, spreading out to create multiple firing angles. They'd learned their lesson about approaching the T-34 carelessly. Now they'd do this properly. Coordinated fire from multiple directions, overwhelming force applied simultaneously. Dmitri and Alexei had perhaps 30 seconds before the end came. Do you think it hurt? Alexei asked suddenly. Your son, when he... Do you think it was quick? Dmitri thought about lying, about offering the comfort of false certainty. But Alexei deserved better than that. They both did. I don't know, he said honestly. I hope so. But I think even if it wasn't quick, even if it was terrible, he faced it like a man, like a soldier. Like someone who understood that some things are worth dying for. Like stopping the Germans from taking Moscow? Like standing between evil and the people you love, Dmitri corrected. Like refusing to let monsters have the world without a fight. Like being able to look at yourself in the mirror and know that when it mattered, you didn't run. The T-34's engine coughed once, twice, and died. The sudden silence was almost shocking after the continuous roar of the past few minutes. In the quiet, they could hear the wind whistling through the shell holes in the hull, the ticking of cooling metal, the distant shouts of German soldiers coordinating their final assault. I'm glad I didn't run, Alexei said. Me too, Dmitri replied. They could see the German tanks preparing to fire, could see the turrets traverse with mechanical precision, could see the gun barrels elevate to the exact angle needed to punch through the T-34's armor at this range. Could see their death approaching with mathematical certainty. Dmitri put his hand on Alexei's shoulder. The younger man was shaking, from cold, from fear, from the adrenaline crash that followed combat. But his eyes were clear, and his jaw was set with determination. Your sister would be proud, Dmitri said. Your son would be too, Alexei replied. The German guns fired. 3 shells launched simultaneously, converging on the crippled T-34 from 3 different angles. There was no surviving this, no miracle left, no escape, just the mathematics of high-velocity steel meeting armor plate. In the last moment, Dmitri found himself thinking not of death, but of the workshop where he'd spent most of his life. the smell of oil and metal shavings, the satisfaction of coaxing one more season of work from a tractor everyone else had written off as junk. The pride of teaching young Mikhail how to read an engine's health by the sound of its idle, how to diagnose problems by feel and smell and experience. He'd spent his whole life fixing things, keeping machines running when they should have failed, finding solutions where none existed, making the impossible merely difficult. Today, he and Alexei had fixed one last thing, had taken a dead tank and a collection of tractor parts and created something that lived just long enough to matter. Had stood between the Wehrmacht and Moscow for 5 minutes that felt like 5 hours, had proven that determination and skill could temporarily overcome superior force. It wasn't enough to change the course of the war, wasn't enough to save Moscow or stop the German advance or bring back the millions who'd already died, but it was enough to know they'd tried, enough to die standing rather than running. Enough to add their names to the long list of people who'd looked at the darkness and chosen to light a candle rather than curse the night. The shells hit. From the diary of Oberleutnant Klaus Weber, Commander, 3rd Panzer Company, 7th Panzer Division, December 3, 1941, Volokholamsk Sector. Today we lost 2 tanks to what we initially believed was an abandoned T-34. When we investigated the wreckage after the engagement, we found something remarkable. The Soviet tank had been repaired, if you can call it that, using parts from agricultural machinery, tractor gears, harvester drive shafts, welded together components that should never have functioned. The crew was 2 men, both civilians based on their clothing. Mechanics, we assume. They had no business being in a tank, let alone damaging 2 of our panzers and killing 8 German soldiers. By all rights, their improvised repairs should have failed before the tank moved 10 meters. But they fought with their broken machine until it literally fell apart around them. We found them in the commander's position, still at their posts, still facing toward us. They never tried to surrender, never tried to escape, just kept fighting until there was nothing left to fight with. I ordered them buried with full military honors. My men thought I was mad, showing respect to enemies who weren't even soldiers. But I've been fighting the Russians for 6 months now, and I'm beginning to understand something that makes me fear for our ultimate success in this campaign. These people, from their soldiers to their civilians, from their generals to their mechanics, they simply refuse to accept defeat. They take broken things and make them fight. They stand their ground when any rational calculation says they should retreat. They turn plowshares into swords and face our tanks with rifles and Molotov cocktails and impossible courage. You can destroy their armies, burn their cities, advance 1,000 kilometers into their territory. But you cannot make them quit. We buried the 2 mechanics in the shadow of their impossible tank, marked their graves with Orthodox crosses we salvaged from the ruined village church. As we shoveled the frozen earth over them, I found myself wondering, if these were just mechanics, what will we face when we finally reach Moscow and meet their best soldiers? The temperature tonight is -25 degrees. My men are exhausted, our tanks are breaking down, and our supply lines stretch back across half of Russia. We are still advancing, still winning battles. But for the first time since we crossed the border in June, I wonder if winning battles will be enough. The Russians have shown us today what desperate men with nothing left to lose can accomplish. God help us all when they find out what determined men fighting for something they believe in can do. Final note. The names Dmitry Volkov and Alexei Kuskov are fictional, but their story is based on documented instances of Soviet civilians and soldiers performing exactly this kind of field repair during the desperate winter of 1941-1942. Mechanics, factory workers, and collective farm equipment specialists did indeed cannibalize agricultural machinery to repair damaged military vehicles as the German army closed in on Moscow. The T-34 tank, despite its revolutionary design, suffered from chronic mechanical problems early in the war, particularly transmission failures. Soviet resourcefulness in field repairs became legendary, a necessity born from the catastrophic losses of equipment in the opening months of Operation Barbarossa. The German advance on Moscow stalled in December 1941, stopped not by any single battle or hero, but by the combined effects of Soviet resistance, brutal winter weather, overstretched supply lines, and the cumulative effect of thousands of small actions like the one depicted here. Every minute the Germans were delayed, every tank they lost to improvised resistance, every drop of fuel they expended on mopping up operations, all of it added up to the failure of what Hitler had assumed would be a quick, decisive campaign. The two mechanics in this story represent millions of ordinary Soviet citizens who found themselves on the front lines of a war they never wanted, fighting with whatever they had, dying in places whose names no one remembers, buried in graves no one visits. Their individual stories are lost to history, but their collective impact changed the world. The end.